All right, so here is another one of 7.1's problems that are already rigged up for factoring by grouping. In other words, they have already done the first part of this problem for us. So all we have to do is recognize that I have a C minus 9 and a C minus 9 that I can factor to the front. So I'm just going to leave it in its little parenthesis there. That's important because it's the whole C minus 9 that's being factored out. And then when I take this whole portion here and divide it by C minus 9, can you see that I have a 7D? And then I'm going to divide this portion by C minus 9 and I get a negative 1. And now this is the factored equivalent to what we had before. Okay, so then this one is our first factoring by grouping that wasn't started for us already. So now we're going to take the first two terms, and remember I showed you on the board that it doesn't always have to be the first two and the last two. We can usually mix them up and do them two different ways, but let's just take the first two and the last two. So we're going to pull the first two out, we're going to pull out a y. Okay, we're going to pull out a y, and when we divide this by y, we get a 3z, and we divide the 5y by y, we get a 5. Okay, so then we come over here to the second portion, and we're going to pull out its greatest common factor, which is a 3. The 9 and the 15 both have a 3, so 9z divided by 3 is 3z, and 15 divided by 3 is 5. And now, can you see that I have both parts of the problem have a 3z plus 5? So I pull out a 3z plus 5 to the front, and I'm left with a y plus 3 when I finish. Okay, so this one is a really good example of one that could be done two ways. All right, so I'm going to come back and do that one a different way. Let me just erase this board. So I'm going to put this one, I'm going to copy the same problem, 3yz plus 5y plus 9z plus 15. Okay, so the same problem that we just finished working, but now I'm going to group them differently. I'm going to group the z's together, and I'm going to group the 5's together. Just showing you that I can do these a couple of different ways. So out of these two factors, we have a 3 and a z in common. So I'm going to pull out the 3z, and I'm going to be left with, when I pull out the 3z, I'll be left with a y, and I pull out the 3z, I'll be left with a 3. And then I look at these other two terms, and I'm going to pull out a 5, because they have a 5 in common. And when I divide this by 5, I get a y, and I divide this by 5, I get a 3. Now, can you see that I have a y plus 3 in common? So I'm going to pull the y plus 3 out to the front as a greatest common factor, and then 3z plus 5 is my remaining factor. Now notice I did the same problem two different ways, and look at my answers. Okay, the first one had a y plus 3 on the front. This other one had a y plus 3 on the back. This one had a 3z plus 5 on the back, and this one had a 3z plus 5 on the front. So I wound up getting exactly the same answer, because remember that multiplication is commutative. Let me see if I can get that glare out of my window. All right, so here is another factoring by grouping problem. Okay, so on this one, I'm going to go ahead and group it differently than just the first and the last, because I can see 7's here and I can see z's here. So I'm just going to rearrange it a little bit. So I'm going to say, okay, out of the first one, I'm going to pull out a z. And when I pull out a z, I'll get a y squared and then a minus 1. okay? And then over here with these two, I'm going to pull out a 7. And 7 divided by 7 is a -1, but I'm going to put it at the back because I want these to match. And then 7y squared divided by 7 is y squared. And I'm going to pull out the y squared minus 1. And I'm going to get z plus 7. Okay, now look at your factors. Those are correct. Can you see a factor that it is not completely factored? And that's this one right here. Recognize a difference of two squares. And that y squared is a square and 1 is a perfect square. So this is a difference of two squares. So from what we learned in 6.4, this is going to factor as y plus 1, y minus 1, if I'm going to completely factor it. So even though this is 7.3, I'm trying to get you to see them as they pop up, okay? So we're going to finish this with y. I'm going to write the factors on top of each other because I'm out of room. Y plus 1 times y minus 1 times z plus 7 would be the final answer. And these are all multiplied times each other horizontally, but I just ran out of room. Okay, so the next one, factoring by grouping. Okay, now I can see things that I can pull out here if I just group these together and these together. So I'm going to start with that. So I'm going to pull out a C, and when I pull out of C, I get a D minus 4. Okay, and then I'm going to pull out a 5 out of these two, and I'm going to get a D minus 4. So then I'm going to pull out the D minus 4 that they have in common, D minus 4 and C plus 5. Now, when I FOIL that together, and I should be foiling these together to check, when I FOIL this together, do I get back here? D times C, my first, gives me D times C. Okay, D times 5 gives me a 5D. C times -4 gives me a -4C. And -4 times 5 gives me a -20. So it does FOIL back to check. The last one on 7.1 is right here. And I'm going to keep the first two terms together and the last two terms because they look pretty good that way. So I'm going to pull out a 10t out of the first two terms. And then I'm going to be left with a u minus 1 when I divide out the 10t. And then over here, I'm going to pull out a -8 because I want to have a positive u right here. So I'm going to pull out a -8, which would give me a -1 when I divide 8 by -8. So now I will pull out the u minus 1 and be left with 10t minus 8. But as I've moved along, I can see I made an error. Can you see the error that I made? It's not really an error if I correct it now, okay? Because I forgot to pull out the greatest common factor. Because I forgot to pull out a 2 at the very beginning, I still have a 2 that could factor out. So I'm just going to go ahead and factor it out, and I'm going to make this 2 5t minus 4. Okay, so I'm factoring that. And then since I want my 2 in the front, I'm just going to move this factor to the back, u minus 1, because multiplication is commutative. So this would be the completely factored answer. So if you were smarter than I am, you would have seen the 2 at the beginning of the problem and not left it for the end of the problem. But the big issue is that you finally take it out and have any greatest common factors in the front. So we have handily handled 7.1 and are moving on to 7.2 shortly. And this is Mrs. A, and may God bless your day.